What you are about to hear is a story about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you become the architects of your destruction. It is a story about patience that spans years. About a woman who lost everything in a single night and spent the next decade becoming the one thing nobody expected her to be. It is a story about how revenge, when it is built correctly and executed precisely, does not look like anger. It looks like a wedding. It looks like a smile across a dinner table. It looks like a woman in a white dress standing at an altar next to a man who has no idea that the most consequential decision of his life was made for him years before he ever asked the question. This is Alina Voss's story, and it begins on the night her family was taken from her. Alina Voss was 23 years old on the night of November 14th when she came home to a house that was lit from the inside in the wrong way. Not the warm light of a family evening, the cold white light of emergency vehicles reflecting off windows. She parked on the street because the driveway was blocked by police cars, and she walked toward the house with the specific unreality of someone whose mind is refusing to process what her eyes are already seeing. A neighbor stepped in front of her, put both hands on her shoulders, said her name twice, and then said the words that reorganized every subsequent moment of Alina Voss's life into a before and an after. Her parents were gone. Her younger brother was gone. The house where she had grown up, where her mother had cooked Sunday dinners and her father had taught her to play chess on the kitchen table, and her brother had practiced guitar in the basement until the neighbors asked politely and he kept going anyway. The house was a crime scene. The official determination, made within 72 hours by the county detective assigned to the case, was that the fire had been accidental, faulty wiring in the basement, a tragic coincidence that had spread faster than the family could escape. Alina stood outside the crime scene tape for 4 hours that night. She was still there when the sun came up. She was looking at the house, and she was thinking about the man she had seen leaving her parents' street 20 minutes before she arrived. A man whose car she recognized, a man whose name she knew, a man who had been her father's business partner for 6 years and who had been in a dispute with her father over the company's ownership structure for the preceding 8 months, and who had, according to her father in a phone call 3 weeks earlier, threatened to make things complicated if the dispute was not resolved in his favor. His name was Gerald Ashworth, and he was the reason Alina Voss spent the next decade becoming someone she had not been before. Alina told the detective about Gerald Ashworth's car on the street. She told him about the phone call with her father. She told him about the ownership dispute and the threat. The detective listened with the specific patience of a man who has heard many things from grieving family members in the hours after a loss and who has learned to hold those things lightly until evidence confirms or contradicts them. The investigation found no evidence connecting Gerald Ashworth to the fire. The faulty wiring determination was supported by the fire investigator's report. Gerald Ashworth had an alibi for the evening, a business dinner with 4 colleagues at a restaurant downtown, confirmed by credit card records and witness statements. The case was closed as accidental. Alina filed a formal request for review. The review affirmed the original determination. She hired a private investigator with the money her parents had left in an account she was the beneficiary of. The investigator spent 3 months and produced a report that was suggestive but not evidentiary. She took the report to a civil attorney. The attorney told her the report was not sufficient to support a civil action. She went back to the detective. He told her the case was closed. Alina Voss was 24 years old, and the people who had taken her family were living their lives without consequence, and the system that was supposed to produce consequences had told her 3 times that there was nothing it could do. She sat in her apartment on a Friday evening in January with the private investigator's report on the table, and she made a decision that she understood would require years, and that she was prepared to give years to because she had nothing else she was going to give them to. Alina spent the next 10 years becoming the person the plan required, not the person she would have been if the house had not been a crime scene, not the person her parents had raised with Sunday dinners and chess games and basement guitar. The person the specific objective required. She went back to school and studied law and graduated at 27 near the top of her class and took a position at a firm that specialized in business litigation, where she spent 4 years learning how companies and their ownership structures and their disputes and their resolutions actually worked from the inside. She learned how money moves through business entities and how ownership is documented and how disputes are settled and how the people who win those disputes win them and what the people who lose them did wrong. She was exceptional at the work. Her colleagues found her focused and precise and occasionally unsettling in the specific way that people who have a private objective beneath a professional surface are occasionally unsettling without anyone being able to name exactly why. She left the firm at 31 and took a position at a different firm, smaller boutique. specializing in the specific area of business law that was most directly relevant to what she had been building toward. She was 32 when she met James Ashworth, Gerald Ashworth's son. James Ashworth was 35 years old when Alina met him at a professional conference in Charlotte. He was, by any reasonable assessment, a decent man. He had grown up in a wealthy household built on a company that had been his father's, and that James had largely inherited the running of after Gerald had stepped back in his late 60s. James was not his father. He did not have his father's specific ruthlessness or his father's willingness to remove obstacles through means that left crime scene tape on a street in November. He was a man who had grown up comfortable and had remained comfortable, and who had the pleasant limitations of a person who had never been required by circumstances to develop anything beyond comfort. He was also a man who had complete knowledge of his father's business affairs and access to the company's historical records, going back to the years of the ownership dispute with Alina's father. Alina understood all of this within 3 months of meeting James. She understood it because she had spent 10 years understanding exactly this kind of thing, and because understanding it had been the preparation for this specific meeting, even when she had not known this meeting was coming. The meeting had been coming since the night she stood outside the crime scene tape and watched the sun come up. She had simply not known what form it would take. Now she knew. I want to be honest about what Alina's relationship with James was in the years of its development, because honesty is how this story has been told, and because the complexity of what Alina was doing deserves honest description rather than the simplified version. Alina did not hate James. She had no specific grievance against him as an individual. What she had was a purpose that required access to things that James could provide, and a willingness to pursue that purpose through a relationship that began as a means and became, over time, something more complicated than a means, because James was a genuinely decent man, and because Alina was a human being and not a mechanism, and because years of professional proximity to a person who is treating you well produces feelings that a person cannot entirely control, even when she is aware of the architecture of the situation she has constructed. She felt something for James. She did not allow what she felt to redirect her from what she had come for. That distinction between feeling and direction was the hardest thing about the 3 years between the Charlotte conference and the wedding, and she did not discuss it with anyone, and she carried it alone because it could not be shared with anyone who did not already know everything, and there was no one who knew everything. She was the only person who knew everything. She carried it the way she had been carrying things for 10 years, alone, and with the specific discipline of a woman who had decided that what she owed her family was more important than what she owed her own comfort. They married on a Saturday in September at a venue outside Charlotte that James had chosen because his mother had been married there 30 years earlier. Alina wore white, and she was, by every account of everyone present, the most composed and the most beautiful and the most present bride anyone in the room had seen. She stood at the altar next to a man whose father she believed had murdered her family, and she said the words, and she meant the ones that could be meant honestly, and she held the ones that could not be, and she accepted the ring, and she kissed her husband, and she turned to face the room full of people who were smiling at the beginning of something that Alina understood was not a beginning but a step. The third step in a plan that had started with a decade of becoming, and had moved through the meeting in Charlotte and the 3 years of careful proximity, and had arrived here, at this altar, at this ring, at this access. The access to the company's historical records, the access to Gerald Ashworth's professional correspondence, the access to the financial history of the ownership dispute with her father, the access that a daughter-in-law, established and trusted and present at family dinners and business discussions, and the casual conversations where careful people do not guard themselves the way they guard themselves with strangers. That access was what the wedding had activated, and Alina had spent 10 years preparing for what she was going to do with it. The search took 11 months. Alina was careful in the way that lawyers who know what they are looking for are careful, which is to say she was not searching blindly, but navigating towards specific categories of information with the professional knowledge of where those categories are most likely to be stored and how they are most likely to have been documented. The company's historical records were held in a combination of digital archives and physical files in a storage room adjacent to Gerald's former office that James had converted into a home workspace when Gerald had stepped back from active management. Alina had access to that room. She used it deliberately and infrequently, and she documented what she found in a manner that protected the integrity of the information for the purpose it was ultimately going to serve. What she found over 11 months was a picture that assembled itself piece by piece into the shape she had been expecting for 10 years. financial records from the period of the ownership dispute showing payments to a contractor whose listed services did not correspond to any business purpose Alina could identify. Correspondence between Gerald and a man whose name she recognized from the private investigators' report a decade earlier. Correspondence that was elliptical and careful in the way of communications between people who are discussing something they do not want to state directly. A document that had the specific quality of a document that had been kept because it represented leverage, and that should have been destroyed, but that Gerald, like many people who believe they are untouchable, had kept because untouchable people do not think carefully about the documents they keep. Alina photographed everything. She stored the photographs in a secure cloud account that had been established under a name that was not her name. She sent copies to an address that was not her address. Then she called an attorney who was not her husband's attorney, or her husband's family's attorney, or anyone who had any connection to the Ashworth family or its professional world. She called a woman named Patricia Wells who specialized in cold case civil litigation, and who had, as her first question when Alina described the situation, asked how long she had been building toward this call. Alina said 10 years. Patricia Wells said, "Then we are ready." Gerald Ashworth was 71 years old and had been living for 27 years with the specific confidence of a man who has done something that cannot be proven and has watched the years accumulate as evidence that the unproven thing will remain unproven. He had watched the investigation close. He had watched the appeal fail. He had watched Alina's private investigator produce nothing actionable. He had continued building the company and managing his life and attending dinners and taking vacations and existing in the particular comfort that comes from having concluded that the past has been successfully managed. He received Patricia Wells's letter on a Thursday morning. The letter was accompanied by a document package that was 47 pages long, and that Patricia had structured with the specific architecture of a civil litigation filing designed to establish not guilt in the criminal standard but liability in the civil standard, and to do so with documentation specific enough that the path from the documents to the truth was short and clear and resistant to the kinds of procedural challenges that had closed previous avenues. The letter informed Gerald Ashworth that a civil action was being filed on behalf of the estate of the Voss family, and that the filing was accompanied by a request for criminal review by the State Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, supported by the documentation package, and a formal affidavit from Patricia Wells describing the chain of custody of the documents and how they had been obtained. Gerald Ashworth called his attorney within the hour. His attorney called Patricia Wells. Patricia Wells said the filing was proceeding as scheduled. James found out on a Friday evening when Alina sat across from him at the kitchen table of the house they had shared for 14 months and told him everything. Not the softened version, not the managed version. Everything, the night in November, the crime scene tape, the decade of preparation, the Charlotte conference and what she had understood about what it represented when she walked away from their first conversation. The 3 years, the wedding, the 11 months of searching, the documents, Patricia Wells, the filing, everything. James was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "You married me to get access to my father's files." Alina said, "Yes." He said, "Did you feel anything?" She looked at him. She said, "Yes, that is the honest answer, and I am not going to give you a different one because you deserve the honest one." He stood up. He walked out of the kitchen. He was gone for 3 hours. When he came back, he sat back down. He said, "If what you found is what you believe it is, then my father did what you believe he did." Alina said, "Yes," James said. "Then I am going to cooperate with Patricia Wells's office." He said it with the specific quality of a man who has just been required to choose between two things he cannot hold simultaneously, and who has chosen with the clarity of someone whose fundamental decency, tested for the first time at the level it was being tested, turned out to be real. Alina had not expected that. She had prepared for every version of this conversation except the one where James chose correctly. She looked at him across the kitchen table for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me yet." He said, "We have a long way to go." He was right. They went the long way together. The civil action produced a settlement that acknowledged liability without a criminal admission, which is what civil actions produce in cases where the criminal statute of limitations has passed but the civil standard of evidence is met. The State Attorney General's Cold Case Unit review, supported by James's cooperation and the documentary evidence, produced a referral to the county prosecutor. The prosecutor reviewed the referral and the documentation and made a determination that Alina received in a letter on a Tuesday morning 27 years after the night she stood outside crime scene tape and watched the sun come up. The letter did not say everything she had wanted it to say. The law had run its course in the way that law runs its course, producing partial justice rather than complete justice, which is the most that the machinery of accountability can usually produce when the events it is addressing are 27 years old, and the primary witness is a daughter who built a decade toward this moment and a marriage that was the mechanism of the final steps. Gerald Ashworth died 14 months after the referral, of causes unrelated to the legal proceedings, without a criminal conviction but with a civil finding and a public record, and a family that knew what the documents said. Alina stood at his funeral at James's side, and she did not feel what she had expected to feel. She felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally been able to put it down. She looked at the casket. She thought about her father teaching her chess at the kitchen table. She thought about her brother playing guitar in the basement. She thought about her mother's Sunday dinners. Then she took James's hand. They walked out into the light together. This is Alina Voss's story, a woman who lost everything in a night and spent a decade becoming the person the truth required, who built a marriage as the final mechanism of a 10-year plan and who discovered, in the kitchen conversation afterward, that the man she had married for access had chosen correctly when choosing correctly cost him something real. Justice, when it arrives after 27 years, does not look the way you imagined it would look when you were 23 years old outside crime scene tape at sunrise. It is smaller and more procedural and less complete and more exhausting than the version you carried through 10 years of preparation, but it is real, and it is documented, and the record exists, and the truth is in the record. And Alina Voss put it there. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Subscribe if you have not already. Topic 3 is coming, and it will not disappoint.